Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight will be part one on my two-part series on Phil Spector. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Phil Spector was born on December 26, 1939. In 1949, Phil's father sadly committed suicide. In 1953, Phil, his sister, and his mother moved to Los Angeles, California. It's at this time when Phil became involved with music, specifically learning to play the guitar. While attending high school at Fairfax High School, Phil, along with three friends, Marshall Lee, Harvey Goldstein, and singer Annette Kleinbard, formed a group together called the Teddy Bears. During this time, Phil also began to hang out at local recording studios. He was able to get tutored by Stan Ross, who was co-owner of Gold Star Studios in Hollywood in record production. In 1958, the Teddy Bears had raised enough money to buy 2 hours of recording time at Gold Star. Phil acted as producer, and together they recorded a song that Phil wrote called Don't You Worry, My Little Pet. This helped them secure a deal with Error Records. At the Teddy Bears' next recording session, they recorded another song that Phil had wrote called To Know Him Is to Love Him. This was able to reach number 1 on the Billboard's Hot 100 singles chart. By the end of the year, it sold over 1 million copies. This allowed the Teddy Bears to sign their next deal with Imperial Records. They then went on to record their next single called I Don't Need You Anymore. But this didn't reach the same level of success. It only reached number 91. Although the band went on to continue to release more songs, never again did they chart in the Hot 100. In 1959, the Teddy Bears split up for good. Well, Phil wasn't deterred and went on to his next project called the Spectors 3. It really wasn't that successful either, but it did lead to an opportunity in 1960 for Phil to work as an apprentice in New York. There, he quickly learned how to use a studio. He was able to co-write music and also worked as a session musician, most notably playing the guitar solo on The Drifters on Broadway. Well, after this, Phil returned to Hollywood, and in the fall of 1961, he formed a new record company with Lester Sill called the Phyllis Records. Phil secured the band called the Crystals for his new label. In the early 1960s, Phil went on to briefly work with Atlantic Records R&B artists Ruth Brown and Laverne Baker. Phil went on to take a brief job as head of A&R for Liberty Records. While working there, a song called He's a Rebel was due to be released by Vicky Carr. But Phil rushed into Gold Star Studios and went to record a cover version using Darlene Love on lead vocals. The record was released on his album company, Phyllis Records, attributed to the Crystals. It quickly climbed and rose to the top of the charts. Now, at this point, Phil went on to create something that is so well known now, known as the Wall of Sound. Well, what is the Wall of Sound exactly? It's a production technique yielding a dense, layered effect that reproduces well on AM radio and jukeboxes. That was really big at the time. In order to obtain the sound, Phil gathered large groups of musicians playing orchestrated parts, often doubling and tripling many instruments playing in unison for a fuller and richer sound. Now, by this time, Phil had already started to kind of get a reputation for himself, and it wasn't always positive. He was becoming known as being temperamental and having a quirky personality with strong and unconventional ideas about musical and recording techniques. He was against stereo releases, claiming that it took control of the recording sound away from the producer in favor of the listener. He also preferred singles to albums, describing LPs as, quote, 2 hits in 10 pieces of junk, end quote. In early 1965, the song You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' became the label's second #1 single. 3 more major hits with the group followed, called Just Once in My Life, Unchained Melody, you might have heard of that, and Ebb Tide. In 1966, Phil's last signing to Phyllis Records was a small little duo. You might know them as Ike and Tina Turner. 1968, Phil married Veronica, known as Ronnie, Barnett, lead singer of the Ronettes. In 1970, Alan Klein, manager of the Beatles, brought Phil to England. He assisted in producing John Lennon's hit solo single, Instant Karma. At this time, Phil was invited by John Lennon and George Harrison to take on a task of tuning the Beatles' abandoned Get Back recording sessions into a usable album. Phil made significant changes to the arrangements and sound of some of the songs. This resulted in an album called Let It Be, which ended up being a massive commercial success and one of the best-known Beatles albums. In 1971, Phil was named director of A&R for Apple Records. He held that position for a year. Now, John Lennon used Phil again for the 1971 Christmas single, Happy Christmas, War is Over, the 1972 album, Sometime in New York City, and the 1973 sessions for the album Rock and Roll. Phil's relationship with Lennon, however, ended during these sessions. There are several different versions as to why. One version is that Phil suffered a breakdown in the studio, producing a gun, and disappeared with the rock and roll tapes. The Phil Spector biographer, Dave Thompson, states a different version of what happened. In his version, he placed most of the blame on an out-of-control John Lennon and his entourage. Well, you can decide for yourself. In the end, after several months, Lennon retrieved the tapes and finished the album himself. In 1974, Phil created the Warner Spector label. March 31st, 1974, Phil was seriously injured when he was thrown through the windshield of his car in a crash in Hollywood, California. He was admitted to the UCLA Medical Center and suffered serious head injuries. This required hours of surgery and over 300 stitches to his face and more than 400 stitches to the back of his head. It is speculated that his head injuries were the reason that he began to wear those outlandish wigs. 1975, the Phil Spector International label was created. In 1989, Phil was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for his contributions to the music industry. In the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, Phil mostly remained inactive. He attempted to work with Celine Dion on her album, Falling Into You, but that deal didn't fall through. He was supposed to produce the entire album, Silence is Easy, by Starsailor, which was released in 2003. However, he was fired from that project due to personal and creative differences. Phil was known to have had many conflicts, sometimes even bizarre conflicts, with various artists, songwriters, and promoters that he worked with, and with his Phyllis Records partner. Lester Sill went on to say, quote, "I sold out for a pittance. It was shit, ridiculous, around $60,000. I didn't want to, but I had to. Let me tell you, I couldn't live with Philip. I just wanted the fuck out of there. If I wouldn't have, I would have killed him. It wasn't worth the aggravation." End quote. And that is part one of my case on Phil Spector. Stay tuned next week for part two, where we dive a little bit more in and it gets a whole lot more bizarre. Now, thank you for sticking for this episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have any questions so far on this case? Well, leave it down below and let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.